Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning's learning is sponsored by Debbie Rogel in memory of her cousin, Judy Licht. Today is her Yortzeit, 16th of Shvat. And I think it's fair to say that Judy had a very strong impact on Debbie finding her place within our community. So we're very, all Debbie's participation in things in our community should be a source for Judy's neshama, and certainly on this day. Thank you very much, Debbie. Okay. Chapter 18, verse 11. We began discussing this pasuk yesterday. This is the reaction of Yitro to the amazing things that God brought for the Jewish people with Egypt and the like. And he says, I now know that God is greater than all other gods. Because in the matter that they sinned against them. It's a little bit of a vague phrase. Because in the matter that they sinned against them. We saw yesterday Rashi citing Unclus, and that the pshat is that the Egyptians tried to do terrible things to the Jewish babies with water. So that's why so many of the Egyptians died in the sea. So it's measure for measure. Let's see the Ramban. Ramban on Pasuk Yud Aleph. Kiv hadavar asher zadu aleihem. Perusho badavar asher hezidu hamitzrim al Yisrael. Yadati shugado mikol Elohim. The fact that the matter in which the Egyptians brought pain upon the Jewish people was the area in which they were punished. That's how I know that God is greater than all other gods. Vitam said, the reasoning behind this is, God decreed on the Jewish people, God told Avraham Avinu that the Jewish people would be slaves to a nation, and that nation would persecute the Jews. For the fact that they enslaved the Jewish people, the Egyptians should not be punished, because this was part of God's plan. Avol hezidu aleya, but it's more than they enslaved the Jewish people. They wantonly persecuted them. And they planned to annihilate the Jews from the world. It's not just that they were slaves in Egypt. Paro tells us people, we have to be wise lest they become too great in number. Paro told the midwives to kill their boys. The and Paro decreed regarding the Jews that all boys born should be thrown into the river. That was not necessarily in the grand plan that God had. That was the Egyptians' own addition. That's why they had this terrible destruction, not because they enslaved the Jews, but because they went so much further than enslaving the Jews. And that's what God meant all the way back when he was talking to Avram, that nation that they'll serve, I'm going to judge them. It's a famous Ramban. So the Ramban gives more than one idea over there, but one of the ideas the Ramban gives is this idea, that the Egyptians did so much more than they needed to do to the Jews. God saw the thoughts of the Egyptians. And because they had such terrible thoughts and plans about the Jews, that's why they're punished in this way. So it's really an amazing pshat when you think about it. So whereas Rashi with the Unclus says the pshat is, it's not a coincidence that they got punished in a means by which they tried to do bad things, or they did bad things to the Jewish people. The Ramban says we see the nuance of God's judgment in the world. That the reason that Yisro intuited, that the reason why they had this terrible punishment, the Egyptians were punished in such a terrible way, was not in the big picture what they did, that they enslaved the Jews. The average person would have thought that's the pshat. So no, that he intuited that it must be because of their unique cruelty, because God had already decreed that the Jews would be slaves. It's a very interesting Ramban to think about. Finally, I want to see the Sforno. Sforno on Pasuk Yud Aleph. Kiva davar asher zadu aleihem ki hitzel es ha'am ba'oso adavar atzmo asher zadu ha'mitzrim aleihem shel Yisrael. That with the very matter that the Egyptians tried to bring problems to the Jews, That's the manner in which God saved the Jews. Kmo ki azireh sharayehu, v'zeh haya shaharag b'choreim, kmo shaharag hamitzrim kol habein ha'yilod liYisrael. What was the 10th and final plague? God killed the firstborn of the Egyptians. The Egyptians tried to kill the Jewish-born boys. God kills their firstborn. V'itbiyam bayam, k'derech shitbiyu heim abanim bayaor. The Egyptians drowned the Jewish babies in the river. God drowns the Egyptians in the river. V'harag asap b'choros k'neged b'ni b'chor Yisrael v'atma'en l'shalcho. That God says that the Jewish people are his firstborn, and that's the message Moshe relays to Paro, and Paro still refused to let them go. So God says, yeah, you don't recognize the fact that the Jews hold this special status for me as a firstborn. I'm going to kill your firstborn. V'hikshes libam acharei shelo shamu b'irtzonam. The Egyptians didn't listen when they had a choice, and so then God hardens their heart after that. So all these things that God does to the Egyptians are all sort of like parallels to things the Egyptians did. It's really the same idea as Rashi said, but it goes into more detail. And with that, God shows us his greatness over all other deities. What nation out there thought that the deities could really pay measure for measure in such a striking manner? So Sforno says the real impressive thing about God going measure for measure is not just, wow, that was neat. It's something else. That up until this moment, nations' ideas of their deities was that their deity excelled in a certain area. This is the god of fire. This is the god of water, which means that each of these gods, by the nation's understandings, are sort of one-trick ponies. In other words, if you anger this god, they're going to fight you back in this way and that way and the other way, all but like in the same general genre. But what's fascinating is God wasn't bound by anything. God could do it all. So the only thing that defined the punishments God would bring were the actions of the Egyptians. And the fact that that was the case proved that God was omnipotent. So that's the pshat, says the Sforno, that Yitro says, wow, I see that God is more powerful than any other deity because the only defining factor in the punishments is whatever the Egyptians happen to do, God will match it. So that's the Sforno's pshat. Some very different ideas in this puzzle. Okay, moving on to verse 21. Yisro tells Moshe he needs to appoint judges. He can't do it all on his own. So it says in verse 21, you should find from among all the nation, Anshe Chaya, literally translated, men of valor, Yirei Elokim, those who have reverence for God, Anshe Emes, people of truth, Sonei Vatza, people who hate monetary gain, and you should station these judges over certain numbers of people. There's a lot of adjectives given here. Men of valor, people who have reverence for God, people who are true, and people who hate monetary gain. 4 different descriptions. What do these all mean? What do they mean? So let's start with Rashi, starting with the second Rashi on Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Anshe Chayo, Ashirim, Shein Tzrichen Lahakir V'Lahakir Panim. So what it means, people of valor, doesn't mean that they're good at fighting people. It means they have success, financial success. What's the benefit of having financial success? Because they're not going to be cowed by anybody. Because they're not going to be impressed by the big wealthy person that walks into the room because they're pretty wealthy themselves. That's what it means, people of valor. Anshe Emes, people of truth. Elu Bale Haftacha, Shem Kedai Lismoch Al Devrayim, Shai Dekein Yu Devrayim Dishmai. People who are reliable in what they say. People who are known that if they say something, if they say they're going to do something, if they say something is the case, you can take it to the bank. Because if there are people that are so reliable in their word, their audience will be more inclined to listen to what they say. So their judgments will be more likely to be accepted. Sonei Vatza, people who hate monetary gain. Meaning, says Rashi, Shesonim es mamonam badin. Okay, Damrina called Dayana Damafkin Mamona Mine Bedina Lav Dayanahu. It's very interesting. So he's citing the Gemara in Baba Basra that it's a specific sort of aspect that we look for in a judge to not be the type of person who would lose a court case about money. In other words, when you think about it, the type of person who loses a case about money means that they're engaging in activities. I mean, everybody makes mistakes, but if they're taken to court over it, that means they're having a dispute with someone about a monetary matter and they lost, which means that they really probably shouldn't have been in the dispute in the first place. So people like that who get into monetary disputes that they end up being wrong about, what that probably means is that they're too attached to their money. So according to Rashi, Yirei Elokim is obvious, people who have reverence for God. So it means people who are, it's interesting how many of these things revolve around money. People who are wealthy, people who aren't the type to lose monetary cases in court, people whose words are as good as gold, and people have reverence for God. That's how Rashi understands it. Let's start the Ramban on Pasuk Kaf Aleph. V'tam anshe chayil, anashim ru'uyim lahanig am gadol. People who are fit to lead a large nation. Kiko kibbutz va'osef yikarei chayil, ve'einenu biyotze tzav ha'milchama bilvad. The Ramban says chayil connotes large groups of people. He says it doesn't necessarily mean only militarily speaking. Of course, that's our association. A chayal, right? In modern Hebrew, of course, is a soldier. Even in Tanakh, frequently chayil means military soldier. But the Ramban says it doesn't have to be that way. He brings various rayas, proofs from Tanakh that chayil can mean a large collection of people. V'hine, skipping a few lines. V'hine yikra ish chayil b'mishpatim. So what does it mean? A person who can gather people in a judicial sense. What does that mean? Hachacham hazariz v'hayashar. A person who is diligent and honest. So to be the type of person that if there's a question as to what's right or wrong, people would gather around this person. That's the Ramban says the literal translation of chayil here is that people gather to the person. He can lead people. So a leader in a sense of correctness and diligence about following through on it. That's how the Ramban explains it. Okay. Skipping a couple more lines. We know Yitro diber b'klalu prat. Yitro is speaking in big picture and small picture. Amar. Shiechza anashim ru'uyim lahanik ha'am ha'gadol b'mishpatim. So actually, says Ramban, anshe chayil is like a topic phrase. In other words, you need to pick people who are appropriate to be judges in the nation. That's really all anshe chayil means, according to Ramban. Uprat, and then what are the factors that go into that definition? Well, number one, shu yirei elokim, they need to have reverence for God. Number two, anshe emes, people of truth. Sonei vatz, I hate monetary gain. Kilo yiyu anshe chayil b'mishpat, b'li midos halalu. Because you're not going to really be appropriate to judge if you don't have these three attributes. That's how the Ramban is explaining the pasuk. Now, you might ask yourself, how about being smart? Where does that fall in? We don't have to talk about their knowledge or their wisdom, understanding. That's understood. You need a person who understands the laws, who can analyze a case. If not, why would you ever think to appoint them as a judge? Yisro doesn't even have to say that. But he says, beyond the obvious, these are things that might not be as obvious that you have to be looking for. Okay. This is a good place to stop. So we discussed the Ramban and the Sforno regarding what does it mean when Yisro says the matter that they acted in, that's how they were punished. What's that about? We discussed Rashi regarding the different things Yisro says to look for in a judge. And we just have begun the Ramban's discussion of what Yisro is saying.